Hello, welcome back to Fleet Signal. My name is Alex. Welcome to episode 4 of How to Play Firestorm Planetfall. In this episode, I'm going to look at the pre-game sequence, which are the things that you do before you start playing a game of Firestorm Planetfall. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so let's have a look at the pre-game sequence in Firestorm Planetfall. There are quite a few things that happen in this sequence, but you'll find that the more you play Planetfall, the faster you'll actually complete this sequence and get to actually playing a game of Planetfall. So, in the pre-game sequence we have mutual agreements, set up terrain, roll for game board edge, place objectives, deploy forces, deploy Skydrop sites, choose tactical action cards, the Recon phase, and then the battle begins. So let's have a look at each of these in more detail. Okay, so mutual agreements is simply the part where you arrange to play a game of Planetfall. So you and your friend arrange to play on a certain day at a certain time. You decide how many points you're going to play, how many battle groups you're going to take, all that kind of stuff. That's basically mutual agreements. If you're playing in a tournament, then the tournament organizer will usually let you know all of that stuff in advance. Okay, so next you've actually got to the table and you're ready to start setting up the game. So first you have to set up the terrain. Now this can be done in two different ways, friendly setup or competitive setup. Friendly setup is pretty easy. All you do is arrange the table so that it looks cool, or so that it looks a certain way, the way you want it to look. Competitive setup is a bit more structured, and this is how you do it. First you divide the board into 24-inch by 24-inch sectors, and then you roll a d6 into each sector. On a 4, 5 or 6, place an activation marker in that sector. And you keep doing this until all the sectors have been accounted for. If your dice rolling is terrible like mine and you don't manage to place a marker in any sector, then you're allowed to place one marker in any one sector of the board. Next, you and your opponent make an opposed tactics roll. And whoever wins the roll gets to put down the first piece of terrain, removing an activation marker as they do so. That is your activation marker, not your opponent's markers. And you and your opponent keep doing this until all the activation markers have been removed and all the terrain has been placed down. Each piece of terrain must be at least 4 inches away from any other terrain, and no piece of terrain can have a footprint of more than 12 by 12 inches. Okay, next you roll for game board edge. So you and your opponent make another opposed tactics roll, and whoever wins the roll gets to choose which game board edge will contain their deployment zone. Okay, next it is time to put down objectives. Objectives are really important in Planetfall, and you'll probably win more games through capturing objectives than through destroying your opponent. In Planetfall there are 3 types of objectives: primary, secondary and tertiary. The primary objective gives you the most points, the secondary objective is still important and still gives you points for holding it, and the tertiary objective is your opponent's primary objective. So it gives you the least points, but it gives your opponent the most points, so you should try to defend it as much as you can. In the average game of Planetfall of about 4,000 to 5,000 points, there will be 1 primary objective per player, there will be 2 secondary objectives, and 1 tertiary objective per player. Okay, so to place objectives, first you and your opponent make an opposed tactics roll. You make a lot of these in Planetfall. And whoever wins the roll places their primary objective first somewhere in their opponent's deployment zone. So although this is quite a small board, let's say the opponent's deployment zone was back here and I put down my primary objective over there. And then the other player puts down their primary objective. Next you place secondary objectives. So you and your opponent make another opposed tactics roll, and whoever wins the roll places their secondary objective first. The secondary objective has to be placed somewhere between the outer edge of your opponent's deployment zone and the center of the table. So I might put it there. Finally, you don't place tertiary objectives because, as I said earlier, your tertiary objective is your opponent's primary objective, so it's already been placed. When placing objectives, remember that no objective can be within 8 inches of another objective, either primary or secondary. Another thing to bear in mind about capturing objectives is that only models with the take and hold mar can capture an objective. This is usually going to be light recon tanks, light vehicles, or infantry. So for example, these Aquan light skimmers can take this objective, whereas for example a heavy tank wouldn't be able to. The exceptions to this are that flying vehicles cannot take an objective even if they are a light vehicle, and also a squadron cannot capture more than one objective per turn. Okay, next it is time to deploy your forces. So you and your opponent make another opposed tactics roll, and whoever wins the roll deploys their first helix. You have to deploy your forces helix by helix. You deploy a helix, your opponent deploys a helix, and so on and so forth until you've both deployed your armies. And each helix has to be deployed in its entirety before you can deploy another helix. All of your helixes have to be deployed in your deployment zone, unless, for example, you have infantry that are embarked on an APC, in which case they would start off table, or if you have Skydrop assets, which would also be held off table. You might also be playing a scenario which has reserves, in which case they would start off the table as well. You also have to deploy squadrons with at least one model within the command radius of a commanding element in your army, so such as a Leviathan, a heavy tank, that sort of thing. And all models with flying vehicle in their profile have to be deployed flat out at the start of the game. Okay, next you and your opponent deploy Skydrop markers if you have any. If you both do, then you make an opposed tactics roll again, and whoever wins the roll gets to put down their first Skydrop marker. A Skydrop marker can be placed anywhere on the board as long as it's not within 4 inches of another Skydrop marker. You then add a microdice to that marker based on the initial deviation distance for Skydrop markers for that faction, which you'll find on the first page of the faction's Orbat. So for example, if the IDD for your faction were 4, then you'd simply put a microdice in the marker showing 4. Okay, next you and your opponent choose tactical action cards. So in an average game of Planetfall, there will be about 3 to 5 tacs per player. So simply go through your deck and choose some appropriate cards, or you might have some cards already planned out before you came to the table. Finally, for setup we have the Recon phase. In this part of setup, any models with Recon Specialist may make a free flat-out movement action of up to the flat-out movement value in their model profile. So you and your opponent make another opposed tactics roll. Whoever wins gets to do the first Recon move if they so choose, and if they have models to do so. So for example, if I wanted to use these Aquan skimmers to move up to this building here, I would first measure their movement, and then I would move them up to the building so at least one model is within base-to-base contact of the building. And then my opponent will get the chance to do the same with one of their squadrons. However, when making this free movement, no model can come within 16 inches of another model at any time during the free recon move. So if I were to take this building for example, and my opponent had models somewhere over here which were within 16 inches, they wouldn't be able to make the recon move because they would be too close to these models. So this can be a good way to capture objectives, to get models into place at the start of a game, and so on. Okay, and finally, after you've set up the board and made your recon move, you can start to play a game of Planetfall. Okay, that was episode 4 of How to Play Firestorm Planetfall. In this episode, we looked at the pre-game sequence and how to set up a game of Planetfall. In the next episode, we'll look at the turn structure, the pre-turn phase, and movement. As always, leave a thumbs up or a thumbs down on this video, depending on how you felt about it. And also, be sure to subscribe to keep up to date with videos on this channel. Also, be sure to check out Fleet Signal on social media, and also check out fleetsignal.com as well. Okay, that's all for now. Until next time, see ya!